Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Reinaldo Funes Monzote. He is here at Yale as the Henry Hart Rice Family Foundation visiting professor at the MacMillan Center. Professor Funes is an associate professor of history at the University of Havana. He is the author of From Rainforest to Cane Field in Cuba, the award-winning environmental history of Cuba since the age of Columbus. Today we'll talk with Professor Funes about sugarcane and agricultural transformations in Cuba. Welcome, Professor Funes.
Thanks for having me here today. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. You spent a majority of your work on sugarcane, the sugar industry in Cuba. How did you come to study it?
Yes,
What led you to it?
I studied in the University of Havana from 1986 to 1991. You can imagine that moment was a hard moment because all the change in the communist countries. And when I began to work, I went to the History of Science Center. And this was in the moment of the great collapse of the Cuban sugar industry in the 90s. And I want to do a different kind of history about the sugar because during my studies in the University of Havana, I made my thesis about sugar, but in a traditional way. And I want in the middle of this context of the crisis of the 90s to do a different kind of history, to rewrite the Cuban sugar history and link this with the environmental issues. Because from that moment, I want to work with environmental history as environmental historian. And for me, it was very important this different point of view about the Cuban sugar industry. What were the environmental implications of this process of the sugar industry in Cuba from the beginning, but mostly during the 19th and 20th century.
Okay, so give us an overview of what you found, the connect, between the environmental issues and the sugar industry.
I think I want to emphasize the dependence of the environmental condition in Cuba in this process of the expansion of sugar industry from the beginning with the slash and burn system of cultivation of the sugar cane depending of the Cuban forest. Because the forest was I think maybe the most important thing in this expansion of the sugar industry, because forests supply with timber, of course, with firewood, and mostly with the fertility of the Cuban soils. The fertility of the Cuban soil, many of the Cuban soil depend of the forest in that moment. And I want to follow all this process from the beginning to the 20th century of the process of the deforestation of the Cuban plains. And for me, it was very important to emphasize this in the middle of that context of the decline, maybe definitive decline of the Cuban sugar industry at the end of the 20th century.
Okay, so in the processing of sugar cane, does deforestation occur? Tell us a little bit about that. So in the beginning, that's how sugarcane is...
Yes, from the beginning, this depends because Cuba was covered by forests. When the Spaniards arrived, almost all the island, there is different estimate about the amount of forest. Mostly tropical dry forest and rainy forest, but mostly tropical dry forest. And from the beginning, the sugar opened this forest to cultivate the sugar cane, the sugar industry. And from the beginning, the sugar industry was a kind of industrial enterprise in some way because you need to produce the sugar in the site, in the same place where you have the sugar cane fields, no?
Okay.
And from the beginning, this has this characteristic, and at the same time, the use of a slave labor force from Africa, from the 17th century in Cuba to the end of the 19th century. This sugar production depend of the slave labor force, and of course, because the forest and the Cuban environment.
Right, right. So has much of the forest been, what percentage of the forest was lost due to the sugarcane industry?
I think most of the Cuban forests disappeared because the sugar industry's expansion. Of course, there is the cattle ranch, different system of cattle ranch, but during the first centuries, we had the coexistence between the forest and the cattle ranch in different ways, in different. Cuba had a very important shipbuilding industry in Havana during the 18th century, but the kind of deforestation was different. Because sugar need the soil mostly, not the forest. Need the forest in other ways, to use the soil, and of course as a fuel for the sugar industry and as a timber.
Sure.
And this process began around Havana, and the expansion was mostly to the east of Cuba until the beginning of the 20th century. Mostly the main process of deforestation happened between the beginning of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, because new factors in the Cuban sugar industry during the 19th century, the beginning of the process of mechanization that was very early in Cuba compared with other countries. I told this that Cuba was the birthplace of the industrialized agriculture in the tropics, because the use of the steam power from the beginning in the 19th century, very early in the context of the first industrial revolution, and in a very close relation with the United States from that moment. From the 1820s in Cuba, began a process of introduction of the steam powered machines in different moments, And this process, not just the use of the steam machines, the use of railroad in Cuba was very early. Was the second country in this continent after the United States with the railroad system. And the use of a steamboat was very important also. Then Cuba began this transition from the use of animals and human labor force very early in the 19th century, using these new machines from the first industrial revolution. And the main supplier was the United States. And that moment, United States was the main market for the Cuban sugar production. At the same time, United States provide a lot of machines, a lot of foodstuff, and many timber, for example. And this relation was really close from the beginning in the 19th century. Cuba was the main market for the United States in that moment, compared with any other countries in this continent. Compared with Brazil, with Mexico, Cuba was the main exporter to the United States and the main market for the United States production in that moment. And very early, United States replaced the presence of the English in the Cuban English technology or French European technology, French technology in the Cuban market, and this was a very important relation between Cuba and the United States from the 19th century.
Okay, so what happened? Because earlier you mentioned that the sugar industry declined. What led to the decline?
But the decline was mostly in the 90s in Cuba. But Cuba, the sugar industry had a long history during the 19th and 20th century. Almost for two centuries, Cuba was the main exporter of the sugar cane to the world market and mostly to the United States, because this great dependence from the United States market that began in the 19th century remained until the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And this process had different moments, moment of crisis, moment of increase of the sugar production. The process of the deforestation almost finished in the 1920s, because different reasons, because just for that moment the sugar covered all the plain areas of Cuba, the most suitable for the sugar production, and the Cuban forest almost disappeared complete, not in the mountains but in the plains areas, and the condition of production changed from that moment in the 20s. But Cuba suffered a lot during the crisis of the 30s because this huge dependence from the United States market, and we had a great decline in the sugar production in that moment. In the same way that during the First World War, we had the tremendous increase, the double in the sugar, the increase of the amount of the sugar production during that moment of the First War. During the Second World War, the production was recovered again, And we had this different process of the increase or decline in the sugar industry, but always remain as the main source of the Cuban economy, this kind of dependence in relation with the sugar production until the Cuban Revolution, of course.
Yes, what happened during the revolution?
That was another important moment because the conflict between Cuba and the United States in that moment, Cuba can't sell anymore the sugar to the Cuban market, and this was replaced for the Soviet Union, Chinese and other market, but mostly for the Soviet Union, more or less in the same level of dependence compared with the former level of dependence with the United States. More than 75% of the Cuban export or more depend of the sugar production. And Cuba maintained this dependence of the sugar industry until the crisis of the 90s, and with this tremendous collapse of the sugar production in that moment. But
why did it collapse then?
In very different conditions, because from the 50s in Cuba, of course, to maintain this level of production, Cuba began to use more fertilizers, was more dependent for fertilizer, was more dependent for the mechanization to replace the human labor, mostly after the revolution, and was more dependent from these external inputs for the sugar industry. The use of irrigation, for example, increased many times from the moment of the revolution until the 90s. And of course, this created a most vulnerable sugar industry in that moment during the 90s, with the decrease of the oil's importation to Cuba, with the decrease of all this kind of input that were used in the sugar industry. Of course, the situation was even worse every year. And this situation is today more or less the same, this process of the collapse, the great collapse of the Cuban sugar industry, because it was most dependent from this external input compared with the process of the sugar industry in Cuba until the middle of the 15th century, that mostly depend of our own resource, but the resource of the forest was the consequence, the depletion of the Cuban natural resource of this expansion of the Cuban sugar industry.
So does Cuba produce any sugar today?
Yes, today Cuba produce, but not remain anymore as the main source of the Cuban economy after the 90s.
And
now the economy is more diversified, of course. We don't have a very strong economy in different ways, but now we depend more from tourists, for example, from mining, nickel, for example, and for other services that the Cuba provide to other countries.
Right.
And Cuba depends in some way from sugar, remain as the main crop. We have tobacco, of course, that is very important, and other crops, but sugar remain as the main export crop in Cuba. And we have now some kind of effort to increase the Cuban sugar production, but I think not in the same level compared with the past of the Cuban sugar industry, mostly because the situation of the market is changed from the 90s to now, because the increase of the sugar production in Brazil and in other countries. And I think we need to put the Cuban case in our context, in the context of the Caribbean. Compare Cuba with Puerto Rico, with Dominican Republic, with this same kind of process from the 50s until the present. And of course, Cuba remain as the symbol of the sugar remain in Cuba. In different the discussion about sugar, about our history in relation with sugar remain today, because for many centuries or years, told about Cuba was told about sugar. In less way about tobacco, but mostly about sugar. Is an example of one of the most dependent countries of this kind of cash crop economy. And of course, dependent from the slavery during the 19th century, and all these social and environmental consequences remain today in the Cuban society and in the Cuban history.
So in looking and during your work in the sugarcane industry, you've also kind of broadened your research to other areas. Tell us about that.
Yes, I think for me as environmental historian was very important to begin with the sugar, because sugar was the main cause of the transformation of the Cuban environment, of the Cuban landscape, and the Cuban ecology. But I want to continue this study with other activities. Now I'm studying mostly about the cattle ranch in Cuba, about the livestock in general, about the nutrition, the animal proteins nutrition in relation with this cattle ranch. Because for me, the presence of the cattle ranch behind the sugar was the second cause of the transformation in the Cuban landscape. And for me, it's very important also this relation between the sugar industry and the cattle ranch in the Cuban history. We had a very famous author in Cuba who wrote a very famous book about the counterpoint between sugar and tobacco in Cuban history.
Okay.
But for me, in different way, the real counterpoint in Cuban history, in the landscape, in the Cuban landscape, is the counterpoint between sugar and cattle ranch, because different reason. And also I want to emphasize the relation between humans and animals in the Cuban history, not just with plants that are so famous as sugar and tobacco. And I want to talk about animals in the Cuban history as the center in the Cuban environmental history. And that's why in the last year I'm working more about this other history, other Cuban environmental history in relation with the animals in different ways, because I want to talk about the energetic transition in the Cuban history, the social metabolic transition in the Cuban history, the replace of the human labor force, of the animal labor force, what are the implications, the use of the oil in the Cuban economy and in the Cuban society, how this change in the long term, the Cuban history and the Cuban relation with the natural resource in our islands, our archipelago, because Cuba really is an archipelago.
Right, right. How do you think Cuba will change moving forward, especially with its new relationship with the United States?
Yes, I think it's very important, this new age in the Cuban-U.S. relation in different ways. And I think, of course, we are neighbors. We had a really long history together, and our culture has a lot from U.S. culture. Many Cubans live here in the United States, and we need to rebuild this new age in the Cuban-U.S. relation, and this relation will be very important in these concerns about the Cuban agriculture, about the Cuban environment, about Cuba as a market for the United States production, for example, that this was very important traditionally. Cuba was, until the moment of the revolution, the main market for the U.S. agricultural production. More than the 25 or all the export from the United States to Latin America went to Cuba in the moment of the revolution in agriculture, mostly, and U.S. provide a lot of food stuff for the Cuban economy and for the Cuban society and the Cuban people. At the same time, Cuba was so dependent from the United States because this reason. And we need to create a kind of economy not so dependent from the United States in the future. But of course, I think that we need to do this kind of exchange with a mutual benefit between Cuba and the United States, and I think it's possible in this new age. And for me, as environmental historian, my main concern is with the Cuban environment, with the change in the Cuban environment, because we have this kind of history. In the moment of crisis, our relation with the environment is better. In the moment of the good economy, maybe our relation with the environment is worse, and we need to take advantage of the new opportunities in the relation with the environment for the future. And I think to work together with the United States will be very important. And of course, Cuba is potentially one of the main destinations of the Cuban tourists, of the
Yes.
U.S. tourists
Yes.
for the future, as was in the past until the 50s. From the 19th to the 50s, the main destination in the Americas for the U.S. tourists was Cuba, no? And in the future, of course, this will happen. But I prefer a kind of relation more friendly with the environment for the future, because we need to preserve this environment, but because we depend of the environment for this kind of future in relation with tourists, with agriculture. We need to create our own agriculture, able to provide our necessities. And of course, with a lot of tourists arriving to Cuba, we need more food, we need to import more food for this market. But at the same time, we need to create a level of self-sufficiency in the Cuban economy.
Right.
Because we had this experience with the different collapse in the Cuban trade partners or relation in the past, as in the 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union as the main partners for the Cuban economy. And I think we need to think in all of this, and many people here are thinking about this also.
It's a very exciting and interesting time for Cuba.
Yes, of course, yes. It's very exciting with change, maybe with more change in the future. And I think we need some good things, other not so good, but we need to work together. In general, the Cubans and Cuban with the United States, I prefer to think that it's time for to build bridges, not trenches, not in some way as in the past. No?
Yes.
And in general, I am optimistic. Of course, we need to think in realistic way at the same time.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Marilyn.
Thank you. For more information about Professor Funes and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.